I can read it in your messages, how frightened people are and how despairing they are. And I get it. Believe me, I get it. But the Trump administration's attempt to create a dictatorship here in the United States is not going very well. I mean, there are very public things we see. There are the ways in which the administration is trying to humiliate Americans by, for example, going into where the firefighters were fighting an active fire and demanding to see their IDs to make sure they were Americans, and then taking and arresting two of people who were allegedly undocumented immigrants who were fighting an active fire, and telling the people who said, "Can we say goodbye to them because we're like a family here?" Expletive off. We're gonna just do this, and there are many ways in which the administration is really trying to act as if it is Vladimir Putin's government in Russia, or um, the dictatorial government in any number of places in the world. But so far, Americans are pushing back really powerfully. And what's happening at the CDC is an example of that. And I'm going to say more about that going forward. But you've heard about the purges at the CDC, and there is pushback against them. And there is at least a suggestion that these changes aren't going to stand. So I'm going to go with that for a little bit because I want to emphasize what I was talking about the other day with the Trump administration. I talked about it on Tuesday, but it bears repeating because I feel like people are afraid of a paper tiger, as they say. That is, Trump and his administration, and I do not believe he is the one calling the shots here. I believe that Stephen Miller, the deputy White House chief of staff, the person who is behind the massive deportations and is the absolute white nationalist, is behind them. And I believe Russell Vogt, who is the director of the Office of Management and Budget, who was a key architect of Project 2025, and who has been decimating the U.S. government in order to put in place a theocracy. Right now, it really looks like those two are the ones primarily calling the shots, which, just as in a little bit of a side, is really interesting from a structural point of view. As I said to you months ago, power doesn't automatically vest in one spot or another. And there's been a lot of power sloshing around Washington, D.C. At first, it looked like Elon Musk was going to pick it up. It was pretty clear Trump didn't have a lot of it. Now it looks like Stephen Miller and Russell Vogt are the ones who are trying to grab hold of that power. But they are vulnerable because neither one of them is in an elected office. Neither one of them has their own power base, and they are dependent on President Donald Trump, who is himself a really loose cannon. So, and I've explained to you before what a loose cannon is. It's from the old days of warfare at sea, of naval warfare, when the cannons were chained to the deck because of the recoils. And if the chains snapped during that recoil of the cannon shooting off its cannonball, that cannon would ricochet around the internal pieces of the ship and destroy everything. This would just be an incredibly heavy piece of iron smashing around on everything. And so when you say somebody is a loose cannon, it really has this meaning of really being randomly destructive. And I think that really works in this case. But Trump is not in good shape. If you watch anything he does, he is very clearly a loose cannon. They are having to stroke his ego all the time. He is increasingly doubling down on the idea of sort of being a real estate mogul in Washington. There are many things that he is, as an individual, appears to be unable to handle in the White House, and instead is sort of ending up in a bubble that people are feeding in order to put in place an authoritarian government. And one of the things that I am not the only one watching very closely, but that I am watching very closely, are the ways in which the administration is trying to deploy the military. So you're seeing it in Washington, D.C., for example, but you are seeing it there picking up trash, for example, or mulching the trees in the tidal basin near the Jefferson Memorial or near the Martin Luther King Jr. statue. And there is a sense that those military personnel are there to demonstrate that Trump and the MAGA Republicans control the Capitol. Now, remember, Congress is not currently in session. So you've got the president stamping control on the federal government. And yesterday, the Transportation Secretary, Sean Duffy, announced that the United States government would also take over Union Station. And Union Station is where the trains come and go and where the metro trains run from. And there, it's also where the veterans have been protesting the Trump administration. The guy who burned a flag, he is part of the protests near Union Station. Just as an aside here, one of the best cup of coffees I've ever had was in Union Station last year. So if you're in the area, you might want to check it out. But anyway, um, that takeover of Union Station is important because that will control how people get into and get out of the city on the metro lines. And if you've noticed today, the Trump administration has made noises about taking over South Station in Boston and South, not North Station. And that actually matters in Boston because South Station is the hub of the trains coming and going and the buses coming and going from Boston to the south. So that's sort of outward looking. North Station, which is actually not connected to South Station, which is a real nuisance when you live in the Boston area. But North Station is the opposite. It goes up to Maine. So nobody's talking about taking over North Station, which is where my heart is, because that's where my buses and trains tend to come and go from. But they're not. It's not nearly as well traveled as South Station. But there clearly seems to be a push to at least look as if the administration in the military is going to be in control of the train hubs in the east, on the East Coast at least. And a lot of people go up and down that eastern corridor from Union Station to South Station. That is the Acela corridor, the Union corridor, the Eastern corridor, and that is the most heavily trafficked part of the railroad lines in the United States. So that's a really ominous thing that they're talking about there. Trump is also talking about getting rid of mail-in voting. And that too is an interesting thing because actually we know that both Republicans and Democrats use mail-in voting, and it's a very efficient way to vote. And a lot of countries do it. Trump says the U.S. is the only one who does it. That's simply wrong. A lot of countries do it, but it certainly could be read to suggest that he wants people to have to go to the polls in 2026 and then 2028, where he can station soldiers, which will, by definition, depress the vote. So certainly they are putting in place the tools to try to grab control of the 2026 vote. They are also trying to encourage people to fight for Trump in an election. And that's really pretty obvious today with the announcement that the administration has offered Ashley Babbitt, the former Air Force veteran who was killed at the January 6th assault on the U.S. Capitol when she tried to break into the chamber of the House of Representatives. She was shot by a police officer. And, you can watch that video yourself. And the idea that she is somehow a martyr when she was breaking into a room where our elected representatives were cowering in fear of their lives is really a stretch. So you can see he's trying to encourage this idea, the idea that he pardoned or commuted the sentences of more than 1,500 of the people who were convicted or charged in the January 6th riots. He's clearly pushing this idea. But again, here's the point about that. Why does he need to do that? If he thought he could win those elections fairly, He wouldn't be trying to keep people away from voting. He wouldn't be trying to take control over the touch points in the city. He wouldn't be trying to find a way to station soldiers where people are voting. It's going to be really important to keep in mind that all of these machinations to try and cement the vote in 2026 is because Trump and the MAGA Republicans know that they are profoundly unpopular. And you know how you can tell this? Because in a special election on Tuesday in Iowa, and there was another one, there were a number of them, but there was also a big one in Georgia. In Iowa, a district that had gone for Trump in 2024 by, I think it was 11 points, flipped to a Democrat by 10 points. There was a 21% flip in a Republican district in Iowa just 6 months, just less than a year after that election. So it's going to be really important to remember that those the MAGA Republicans and Trump are deeply, profoundly unpopular. And the reason they're trying to cement their control of the government is because they know that people really, really, really don't like them. So how does this translate then to what we can do? That is, first of all, not to fight the administration on the military side in the streets to give them an excuse to invoke the Insurrection Act or to do any of the military things that Trump is trying to set up, but to continue to fight this on a political level where they know they are losing. So, what does that look like? First of all, that looks like making sure that elected representatives in your states, local governments as well, but in your states and the state houses, because this is where redistricting will take place if there is such a thing, and in the national government are more afraid of their voters. And I don't mean physically afraid, they are more concerned about making sure that those of us who care about democracy are answered than they are concerned about Donald Trump and the MAGA Republicans. And you can see these shifts starting already. You are starting to see Republicans who are not MAGA, but even some of the MAGAs starting to back away from Trump's positions. Now, let me explain a little bit about, and you can look for this. It's not like I have some alchemy here. Take a look at how some of the people are responding to Trump's demands for a redistricting, for example, in Indiana. The Indiana Republicans don't want to do that. Take a look at whether or not Republican governors send National Guard troops to Trump's attempt wherever he does it. You'll see a number of Republican governors don't want to do that. Why don't they want to do that? They don't want to do it because they know that the National Guard system depends on states being able to help each other out. And because here's the kicker, it is very clear that Donald Trump is not going to be here for the 2028 election. I mean, I could be wrong. Maybe the gods will favor him and, drop fairy dust on him, but he is not going to be functioning in 2028 in such a way that he is going to help the MAGA Republican Party. And again, the tariffs haven't even really kicked in yet. So, so a lot of people are looking at the Republican Party under Donald Trump and they're backing away. Now I'm not saying they're abandoning him, but political people and business people are unsure which is going to be the successful place to be in the future. That's what they're trying to figure out. And they're dancing it right now. And you can see them doing it, and you'll see this in people being slow to commit troops, for example, being slow to introduce bills. They're stalling. They're waiting to see what happens, to see how long Trump's going to be around and whether he can turn around the fury of MAGA at him that has been building since early July and even since before that, over deportations, over the economy, and over now the fact that the administration says it will not release any more information about the Epstein files, even though we know that Trump is in them. That is still a real issue. It's still a real issue for MAGA, and it's going to become a bigger issue on September 3rd, the first day that Congress is back in session, when Democratic Representative Ro Khanna from California is working together with Representative Thomas Massie of Kentucky to interview victims of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell in front of Congress. That's going to put that story very much back in the news. And you know that Trump is extremely worried about that. But MAGA is also unhappy about something that Trump dropped very casually the other day in a meeting with the South Korean leader in the Oval Office. And it's listening to his press conferences and his press opportunities now is just like fingernails down a chalkboard. But because he no longer has even any kind of a filter, you hear a lot about what he's thinking about. That's been true for a while, but he just pops out with stuff now that's often a surprise. But if you hear about this stuff, one of the ways, here you go, let me tell you something. If you hear about this stuff and you want to check me, for example, or check anybody about what they say, the way you can do that is you can go to a YouTube channel that offers transcripts, and many of them do. You say you want transcripts, it's there under the little window, and then the transcript appears on the right hand side. If you go to that transcript, you can then search the transcript for a keyword. So if you wanted to read the conversation that I'm about to tell you about, you can go to YouTube, you can look for Trump and South Korean leader. The video will come up and it goes on for a really long time, and normally you wouldn't listen to that because it's hours and you don't have that kind of time. Call up the transcript, search for what I'm going to tell you here, and you can read this exchange yourself. It's actually really quick once you start to do it. And if anybody's interested, by the way, I'm happy to do sort of a tutorial on how to get some of this information. People seem to think I read everything under the sun. I really just know how to do research, and once you know the shortcuts, it's a lot less onerous than you think it is. Anyway, he very casually dropped in that conversation that he wanted to start letting in 600,000 Chinese students to the United States of America. That's about twice as many who were studying in the United States before he got into office. And his sort of casual reasoning, as clear as it could be made out, was the reality that in the United States, because we have so dramatically cut funding for higher education, our higher education really depends on people from other countries coming to the US for college, for university, and for graduate school, because they pay, not always in graduate school, but for college and university. And the difference between a college and a university is a college does not have a graduate school and a university does. But both take undergraduates, the freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, that they have to pay full freight. They don't get the rake-offs that U.S. citizens do. So foreign scholars essentially underwrite our higher education in the United States. And so he sort of very casually said, yeah, we should have these people come in again. Well, MAGA, if you remember, is all about discriminating against foreigners, especially foreigners that they don't consider white. So this lit MAGA's hair on fire, and it got almost no press because it's August and because people, I guess, just weren't paying attention to that particular comment, but MAGA sure was. So as I say, people are watching to see what's going to happen with MAGA and Trump, and whether J.D. Vance, who is the heir presumptive because he's the vice president, can pick up those MAGA voters that Trump lost, and perhaps he will. It's not clear yet. He does not have the political skill that Donald Trump did, even though you can already see that Elon Musk, the billionaire who bankrolled Donald Trump's win in 2024, has backed off on his promise to create another political party and is instead now throwing his support behind J.D. Vance. And he's clearly going to try and buy him popularity. I can't imagine a more charmless politician than J.D. Vance. So whether he can pull it off or not is not clear. But what is clear is that there is still a great deal of slack in support for what Trump is doing and what the MAGA Republicans are doing, and pushing electeds, as they are called, to say, we care about democracy, we care about the Constitution, we care about the laws, we care about science, we care about vaccines. They do too. They just have been sucked into this idea that they've got to back Trump in order to get his voters. And that's going to be something, really, really important to hammer on. So, a couple more things here. One, once again, to remind you that, again, people are looking at the deployment of the National Guard and at the deployment of certain military personnel to the cities to do Trump's bidding. Remember that they can't just walk away. They can refuse an unlawful order, but so far the administration has been very careful to couch their demands in orders that some of which are being challenged in the courts, but which look lawful. So don't assume that the National Guard or that the military wants to be there. I think it's going to be really important to remember and to reiterate that this movement that we are building is not about politics, and it's not about professions, and it's not about wealth, and it's not about any of the different markers that in the past have divided us along political lines. This is quite simply, are we going to lose our democracy to an authoritarian? And the people who don't want to lose it are not necessarily people that you ever expected to be on the same side as. Let me put it that way. But they surprise you. One of the things that astonished me about my last book is that at the beginning of it, Bill Kristol, who was a neocon in the George W. Bush administration, has become really a far, I mean, I guess you could call him center left, but you would not know it was the same man. He is really out front with progressive policies. And this is, again, the same thing we saw in the 1850s and the 1890s and the 1930s. Once people recognize that their democracy is in peril and come together, what comes out of that is never the same thing that went into it. So the example I always love is Lincoln's Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, who was a Democrat. He went into Lincoln's cabinet because he believed in democracy, and he did it out of a sense of duty. And if you looked at him in 1861, you would have thought that at the end of the war, he would have been somebody who, basically sided with the rest of the Democrats coming out of the war. And he was such a fervent Republican by the end of the war that when Lincoln was assassinated, he wandered around the streets sobbing to the point that people thought, his friends thought he'd had a mental break. So and yet, Salmon P. Chase, who was a fervent Republican in the early years, had been a Democrat before the war, but a fervent Republican, becomes a Democrat. So you just don't know whose alliances are going to hold coming out. And going forward, it's all hands on deck in this particular moment. And one of those critical things is going to be to try to remember that those people who are saying, oh, Trump has captured the military, are ceding the ground that we need. He has not captured the military. The military swears an oath not to do the sorts of things that he is asking them to do. And to remember that the American military still, anyway, appears to be acting in the defense of democracy. So, one last thing on that is somebody said, again, what do you say when someone says we're not a democracy, we're a constitutional republic? The answer to that is the same as I always give, but I haven't done it in a long time, and I probably should do a short video on it. That's like saying, I don't have a dog, I have a golden retriever. A democracy and a constitutional republic are the same in that both of them are systems, and so is a representative democracy, are systems in which the people get to elect their representatives, either directly or through representatives. We get to be the ones who determine our government. A dictatorship is one in which a one person rules over everybody and they have no say in who they elect. An oligarchy is when a group of people rule over the rest of people and have no say in who the oligarchs are. Now, the reason that people say this is not a democracy, this is a constitutional republic, is that actually comes in the 1950s from the John Birch Society, which was trying to make an argument for why Black Americans should not have the right to vote. And their answer was this is not a democracy, it's a representative, I'm sorry, it's a constitutional republic, and they are virtually represented by the fact white people can vote. And, if anybody wants to stand on the John Birch Society right now, that's what they're up to, and they should know that. And you can call that out.